Rajiv Gandhi, our ex-Prime Minister, said that if centre allots rupees 100 for the poor, only rupees 15 reaches them.
Corruption hasn't gone away.
In spite of efforts like demonetization, GST.
It's a misconception to think that demonetization was meant to root out corruption. If they thought that it's going to root out corruption, then I am sorry to say that their understanding of economy is quite warped, actually. Rajiv Gandhi, in the true sense of the term, was an accidental prime minister. He was a pilot, he was interested in technology, he was young. You know, one of the big things that happened then is he brought in Sam Pitroda, who then revolutionized telecom in India. He enabled one PCO per village, but the core didn't change.
What do you mean by core?
Core was that the government was the Mai Baap Sarkar.
Yeah. There's an interesting story that's shown in movie Guru and talked about in media that Dhirubhai Ambani wanted to expand capacity. The other ministers were not approving it because for XYZ reason. And then he went to Rajiv Gandhi. He said only one line that I have something remaining from your mother. Let me know if you want to access it.
I've met Dhirubhai, but I've never asked him this question. I've met Anil Ambani many times, Mukesh Ambani a couple of times, but I couldn't ask them this question, obviously.
I still don't understand, looking back in hindsight, what effect did demonetization cause?
I would say none.
We would have expected India to be in a much better position after 32 years of economy opening up. Why hasn't that happened? Hi, this is Siddharth Aluwalia. Welcome to the Neon Show. I'm your host and also founder of Neon Fund, a B2B SaaS fund that invests in the seed stage in the most enterprising software companies coming out of India for the globe. Today, I have with me Rajrishi Singhal. Welcome to the podcast, sir.
Thank you
Your
for that.
book, Slip, Stitch and Stumble, is a fantastic book. I read through it to prepare for the podcast today. Really enjoyed it and made me go back into some of the previous podcasts that I have recorded with, let's say, C. Rangarajan sir, ex-RBI governor, right, on the times of 1991, 1992 when the economy got opened. And you tell about, the India's financial reforms. That was the starting point. And now today we have seen so many reforms. The Indian economy is booming. But I want to go back to a basic question before we delve into the past, right? How have you seen in your career the corruption reduce or increase over a period of time? Rajiv Gandhi, our ex-Prime Minister, said that himself, a Prime Minister, telling that if centre allots rupees 100 for the poor, only rupees 15 reaches them. 85% loss.
Yeah. No, I think corruption hasn't gone away. I think, and I'm not talking about just the financial sector here. I'm talking of the broader economy, broader system at large. And the corruption, if you look at, say, the three levels of governance, which is your center, state, and then local governors, right? At all three stages, there is corruption. Even in law enforcement, there is corruption. So corruption has become an endemic, integral part of our society. And it is becoming now institutionalized. It was institutionalized, but increasingly so, the institutional character of corruption has been embedded. It is getting reinforced with every passing day. And I think the problem of corruption starts with the way we finance our election campaigns. I think the root cause for corruption in our society, in our lives, is primarily the way parties finance their election campaigns. So campaign finance infirmities or distortions, unless they are resolved, and I don't think the electoral bonds are, the ideal instruments for sorting that out. It was one step, but it was, I think, a wrong step in many ways. And no solution is going to be perfect or ideal, but I think we should look for some solutions which makes funding of elections transparent. Having said that, I do feel, however, that maybe in our lives, your life, my life, the incidence of corruption, technology makes sure in some ways that, our interactions with government, officialdom, and the friction points that arise and that give rise to, cause for corruption That has come down slightly for, I'll call it the G2C interaction, government to consumer. But government to business, B2B, that corruption is still there. I mean, we had this conversation among all our friends yesterday, all senior executives, chief executives, and from their experience, they were saying that cost of doing business. So if you are in certain states, corruption is at least 25% of your cost, total cost. And you now have to live with it. And so, but if it's 25%, I'm sure the business is not going to, kind of not pass it on. So at the end of the day, consumer actually bears a higher price for corruption. Because you're paying much higher prices for apartments, for cars, for what have you, because the end consumers has to then bear the cost of this corruption. And I think that's an inefficient way to run the economy, because if you take out 25%, then, in many products, your inflation rate will come down drastically. If you look at, say, medical education, or you look at healthcare costs or education costs, it will come down drastically and make it much more accessible. And so I think corruption isn't going away anytime soon from our lives.
In spite of efforts like demonetization, GST, and all these.
So I think it's a misconception to think that demonetization was meant to root out corruption. If they thought that it's going to root out corruption, then I am sorry to say that their understanding of economy is quite warped, actually, because that's not how the economy works. If there is a person who's corrupt, then his or her resources earned through corrupt means is not kept in cash, right? It will be deployed somewhere. Because you don't keep cash. I mean, cash depreciates in value. So the idea that, all the corruption is accumulated in cash somewhere is a silly idea. Is a very naive idea. So demonetization was, I don't think, although the rhetoric was that they wanted to root out corruption through demonetization, but I think the end objective was completely different.
Now coming back to the economic reforms of India, like how have you seen those in the last 42 years since the economy opened up in 1991, 1992?
Right. So, the reforms process had begun in the 80s. I think it began with the Rajiv Gandhi government. When he became prime minister, he was an accidental prime minister in many ways, right?
And so was Manmohan Singh.
But that was somebody else's
accident.
Yeah. But Rajiv Gandhi, in the true sense of the term, was an accidental prime minister. He wouldn't have been prime minister had his mother not been assassinated. And when he became prime minister, he was a pilot. He was interested in technology. He was young. And he was despairing of the bureaucracy and the control regime. And, he had traveled abroad and he had seen, how lesser controls frees up people, frees up entrepreneurial energy. And he wanted to do all of that. And but I somehow feel that his initial burst of enthusiasm was thereafter curbed somewhat. Again, I think
by the seniors in the system.
Senior in the system who had a lot to lose if status quo changed, as well as bureaucracy. Because bureaucracy was also used to controls, right? I mean, the whole bureaucracy was predicated, the structure, the framework was predicated on the idea that controls is the way to govern.
That is what we borrowed from the British.
Exactly. So it became part of their DNA, right? They didn't have an alternative model in mind.
Yeah. We still call DM the collector because he was collecting taxes during.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I think, and when he did those, initial forms, so he did something called broadbanding. Like, so industrial licensing was in force then. Now, if you were manufacturing trucks, for instance, you needed a separate license to manufacture motor cars. So he said, yeah, it's the same thing almost. It's just, it's four wheels and moves, right? But it's a different looking beast. Why do you need a separate license?
And then somebody can object, then SUV is not a car also, you need a separate
That
license
came
for
later.
SUV.
But he allowed for broadbanding
Yeah.
in certain industries. And that, because he allowed this, broadbanding of licensing, it opened up a lot of energies in the system. A lot of people were able to take advantage of that, and it freed up. So it added to GDP growth, for instance. So little things like that. Then I think, one of the big things that happened then, which, is not appreciated today as much, is he brought in Sam Pitroda, who then revolutionized telecom in India. Till then, we had very few telephone instruments in the country, right? I mean, I don't remember the data now, but one telephone instrument per 10,000 or, something of that
It's
sort.
almost like today in healthcare, one doctor per 10,000 people.
Yeah. And the reason for that was because our exchange systems were outdated, telephone exchanges. And those switchboards, etc., were expensive, monopolized. So Sam Pitroda came and changed that. And what he did was he enabled one PCO per village. That was another revolution that actually changed India. But the core didn't change.
What do you mean by core?
Core was that, so the government was the Mai Bap Sarkar. And government continued to be the Mai Bap Sarkar. Let's say, I mean,
So then
since
this is
you're
not a true democracy, right? If the government is the Mai Bap Sarkar.
Yeah, I mean, there is a question about what is true democracy and whether it exists anywhere in the world at all. But let's me use a financial sector example since we are discussing slip, stitch, and stumble. So if you were automobile manufacturer, hypothetically speaking, and you want to expand, and you needed capital, you had to go to the banks. Now the banks would decide how much money you could get, when you could get, and at what interest rate you could get. And that interest rate was astronomically high.
Like 15, 20%?
18%, 17%, 16%. And you had to then, jump through multiple hoops to get that loan. You could say, I don't want to go to the banks. Let me go to the market. You couldn't go to the market. Because if you wanted to do an IPO, there was a Sarkari Babu called the Controller of Capital Issues who would sit behind a desk and decide how much money you can raise from the market, whether you could charge a premium or not, and whether you could raise money at all, and things like that. So the freedom was not there.
And I believe there was also curb on if you are a car manufacturer, can you manufacture in a year 10,000 cars? If you have to expand your capacity, you have to take permission.
Exactly. Yeah. So for everything, you needed that kind of permission. So that still exists.
That's the Mai Bap Sarkar.
That was the Mai Bap Sarkar. And that was not going away. And the Sarkar, and there were also the government was spending a lot of money through subsidies, through handouts, etc. And that was creating demand because you throw money, people will buy goods, etc. And prices were going up. So inflation was high. Government was borrowing a lot without any, consideration for the future. And so our, fiscal deficit was high, and that was putting the economy in a very difficult situation. So we were importing also much more because when you have high demand and your production capacity is limited in the domestic economy, you have to import, right? So we were importing oil,
And it was causing that fiscal deficit continuously.
fiscal deficit, and your external deficit also. So you were importing much more than you were exporting. So you had to keep borrowing to finance that gap also. And that is what pushed us into the crisis primarily.
There's an interesting story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's shown in movie Guru and talked about in media that Dhirubhai Ambani wanted to expand capacity, and he couldn't get a meeting. Like the other ministers were not approving it because for XYZ reasons. And then he went to Rajiv Gandhi, the then prime minister, and he said only one line that I have some,
Yeah,
something
mother.
remaining from your mother. Let me know if you want to access it.
Yeah, so this has been part of the Bombay folklore. I mean, nobody knows how true that is. I've met Dhirubhai, but I've never asked him this question. I've met Anil Ambani many times, Mukesh Ambani a couple of times. So, but I couldn't ask them this question, obviously. But so that was the kind of economy that existed then. So they were able to expand a lot of capacity. And at that time, I remember in the 80s, late 80s, Reliance was the subject of a lot of raids. So the government at that time alleged that they had smuggled in excess capacity. Now, which the money is challenged in court and all of that, of course. So what was the government's reason for saying this? Because Reliance was actually, let's say, if they had 100,000 ton per year plant, they were producing 120,000 tons. So where was that extra 20,000 coming? So the Reliance company executives explained that we are using certain chemicals, and that's called a swing capacity in chemical plants. When you use certain catalysts, etc., you can push capacity, because this is not a mechanical plant. The petrochemical plants, that is the advantage, and they may have had a point. So I don't remember now where that case went, but that was the allegation at that time, that so they are producing much more than what they were licensed to produce. Now, ideally, basically that is what licensing, creates these kind of distortions.
Virtual barriers.
Yeah, so licensing created many barriers. One of this is, what happened to Reliance and many others, in fact. For instance, if you see, till Maruti came along, we had only two car manufacturers.
Fiat and
Ambassador, okay. And my dad worked all his life for Hindustan Motors, which used to manufacture Ambassador cars. And I had asked him one day, why don't you guys change the design? I mean, it's... So he said, no, we have a full-fledged design team. So I said, what do they do? He said, they change the grill in front.
So when do you think really the concept of free market started to happen in India?
So the concept had been, pushed during Rajiv Gandhi's time, and thereafter. 80s is when we had this bunch of economists and advisors who came down from their, various jobs overseas and decided to come back to India. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Shankar Acharya, Rakesh Mohan, all of these bright, brilliant minds, they decided to come back to India and work in the government. And they kept, putting out policy briefs, papers, op-ed articles, that these are constraints on the economy. So that idea was already there.
And you mentioned in your book that they used to also sometimes leak these to the media.
Yes, exactly. I mean, having been in media, we know that. Yeah. So famously, Montek Singh Ahluwalia wrote this note for the Committee of Secretaries and for the ministers on the reforms required for 6 areas, and how reforms in these areas would really, put the economy on a higher trajectory. It went to the Secretaries Committee, it went to ministers, and they turned it down. And then, lo and behold, it suddenly appeared as in the Express Group in Indian Express and Financial Express. A full thing was carried. So nobody knew what it was. It was called the M document. So many years later, everybody knew it was Montek Singh Ahluwalia's policy brief. But he formally acknowledged years later that it was his brief, in fact. And so when the 1991 crisis happened, it made us aware of our shortcomings and how we were close to
Bankruptcy.
Huh?
Bankruptcy of a country.
Yeah. Complete bankruptcy. We had money enough for just 2 weeks of imports. Nobody was willing to give us a loan. We were looking around for a loan, and everybody said yes, and then went back on their word. We got downgraded twice by the credit rating agencies. And I think the biggest ignominy was when we wanted to pledge our gold. Usually when you pledge our gold, you don't have to move it physically. But that year, because they were unsure of India's status, and it's, that was the biggest blow for India's ego, I think, when they said you have to move the gold physically.
To Bank of England.
Bank of England. And it really, for the first time, the nation really felt belittled. Embarrassed. And
almost 50 years after independence, and you still have to beg.
Yeah. So that crisis, I think, was the turning point for all of us.
And that you think that led to free markets in India?
Well, not exactly free markets, but an attempt to move towards freer markets than what existed earlier. I don't think free markets exist anywhere in the world. Like you said, real democracy.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you used another term, true democracy.
Yeah.
So free markets is an idea that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. All markets have some kind of, distortions, aberrations. And that's the nature of markets.
Yeah, but let's say today I have to produce an electric car in India. Government might not give subsidy, but nobody is stopping me to manufacture an electric car.
You still need permissions. You'll still need permissions from the center, from the state and the local authority.
That's why all these babus control whether I can manufacture.
That control still exist. Okay.
If I have to build let's say a new bank, I think India is the hardest country to build a new bank.
Yeah, but we'll come back to banks a little later. I'll tell you. So I get asked this question a lot. I was in Singapore promoting the book, and there was a book discussion at Singapore Cricket Club, and I was asked that, do you think India has enough banks? Before that, in Bombay, in a private club called the Quorum, also we had a panel discussion around the book, and again the same question came: do we have enough banks? Think about it. So we have public sector banks, then we have private sector banks, then we have about 40 to 49 foreign banks, right? These are commercial banks. Then you have small finance banks.
Yes.
Then you have payments banks.
Cooperatives.
Then you have regional rural banks. And then you have different grades of cooperative banks. You have the state cooperative bank, Apex Cooperative Bank, the multi-state cooperative banks, the district cooperative banks, the urban cooperative banks. This is all regulated by RBI, okay? Then outside RBI's regulatory purview are another bunch of 1 lakh banks or credit societies that exist.
These are non-banking financial companies?
No, these are cooperatives.
Okay.
Then there are non-banking financial companies.
How many of these?
So I don't remember the number offhand, but there's a lot. And most of them give loans.
I assume they would be somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000.
I wouldn't put it at that. Thing is, we're looking at effective operational NBFCs. There are many NBFCs on the paper, on the books, which are not operational. So and they are not regulated also. So they can't lend money. They have capital. They're shell companies. So let's not go there. But with so many institutions, and yet our problem is our credit per capita credit is really very low. So if you look at comparable countries, credit to GDP is much higher for every country than India. So why do you think with so many banks, NBFCs, we still don't have enough credit going out of the door?
Is it because of they are highly regulated? Credit should not be the problem in this case. If let's say for every 100 people in the country, there is at least one such kind of financial
Institution.
institution.
I
Every 1,000
agree.
people, I don't know the exact
No,
number. but
whatever it is, but there is one is people have not. I mean, in these institutions, except for say the public sector banks, have not invested in networks.
What do you mean by that?
By let's say going out, meeting, being very closer to the customer primarily, right? So that was left to the local cooperative banks, rural RRBs. Now their problem is they lack governance, they lack capital. So to be able to give loans of a higher order, you need that kind of capital. And one of the problems with most private banks in India, NBFCs, RRBs, is they don't have capital. But the bigger problem for the cooperative banks and the RRBs is the presence of politics.
What is RRB?
RRB, sorry, I should have said RRB is regional rural banks, which were launched by a public sector bank and the state government.
So SBI would have launched something
in say West Bengal or in Andhra Pradesh with the local government, with the state government. So the state government holds 50% and state bank would hold 50%. And they were supposed to go out into the regional rural areas, right? At one point, there was a crisis with RRBs because they were lending much more than the money they had.
I think some of our states really, they claim they are bankrupt today. For example, Karnataka, which is the IT capital of India because of Bangalore, the government says they don't have any more money to spend. Similarly, states of West Bengal.
But that's a different problem, I think, and that arises because they were used to a lot of the state taxes that have got merged into GST.
But they still get 9% of the GST is 18%.
So they're supposed to get it from the center, right?
Yeah.
So there are delays, lags, etc.
And the center collects the entire 18% and gives it back to the state.
So, they're supposed to, but it comes with delays, lags, and you have these mismatches.
But such an electronic system, I believe there should not be.
But there is. Okay. Yeah.
For everything I buy, the GST is automatically put into it.
Yeah. So that is one. But let me get back to this whole thing about RRBs and cooperatives. Cooperatives are controlled by politicians mostly.
How is that possible?
Because cooperatives is through, it's a bunch of people of the same society or the same locality or the same.
They would appoint the authority there.
So they would use their influence on these people to become the chairman of that cooperative bank or, and if you see, most cooperative banks are controlled by politicians today. And I meant all parties, okay? So not just one party, but all parties want to control these banks.
Then if such as a poor state, then nobody would go to these banks to make their deposits. And if deposits are not there, how will they lend?
Exactly. So the trust factor is also a problem.
And because now even the larger private banks, let's assume State Bank of India also, the top 10 banks in India, their tentacles are in villages, rural areas also. So people would gravitate towards lower interest but higher trust. So who would interact with these small cooperatives?
Right, yeah. So borrowing from cooperatives at one point was very easy, especially if you knew somebody in the bank and, but over time, I mean, I think it's still easy, but the bank can only lend so much, right? When the demand is this much. Um, or I think what is, really required. So you were saying, for instance, don't we have new banks? Why is it difficult to launch a new bank? Now, my question there is: do you think a new bank, when it is launched, it will be able to build a footprint that is large enough to cover uncovered areas? Most new banks will want to set up branches in Alsur in Bangalore, or MG Road in Bangalore, or Nariman Point in Mumbai, or Connaught Place in Delhi. They don't want to go out of those areas. Even though you have so many banks there, it's overbanked that area. So private banks is not the solution, not the only solution. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be allowed, and there should be no restriction on them. I also feel that but there has to be some kind of understanding with RBI that okay, you can have branches in wherever you want in the urban areas, but you should have some network elsewhere also. And the problem is building that network requires capital, and capital.
Ultimately, the problem that we discussed about, why is credit not enough in India? If you have to simplify the answer for that, what will that be?
I would say that it's not enough because banks don't have enough capacity to lend. Banks don't have enough money to lend.
No, but that cannot be true, because if you see Nifty 50, dominated by 30% to 40%, it is dominated by financial institutions. The financial institutions are the most profitable enterprises in India. So how is that possible? They don't have enough money.
So if you look at their profits, okay, they're making money, right? And their profits are. But if you dissect the profits, a large chunk of it actually comes not from lending, comes from doing treasury, let's say foreign exchange trading, bond trading, getting fees for recommending or getting you to invest in some insurance product. Let's say they have a tie-up with an insurance company, and when they convince you that you should invest in this insurance company, they get very good commissions. Right? Or they have a tie-up with 2-3 mutual funds. And when they convince you to invest in those mutual funds, they get very good commissions. So fee income is a large part of their income today. And I think over the past few years, many of the large private banks are putting in a lot of effort in growing that business, rather than the bread and butter lending business. Yeah. Also, at the same time, Siddharth, the other problem is we do not have enough private sector investment. So
what do you mean by that?
In the sense that, so if you look at government money where it is being spent, a large chunk of it is being spent in building roads, dams, infrastructure, right? Ports, etc. And it's a good strategy, because when your economy is not growing enough and you need it to grow, typically governments start spending first, especially on infrastructure projects, because these have long tails, and it also gets the private sector to then come in and invest, because when government is investing, so let's say it's building roads. Now the cement company, it'll buy cement for the road. It'll buy people, so it'll employ labor, and all of that is generating income. So people will then want, new shirts, want to eat more, new pair of sneakers, whatever. Okay. And so that will generate its own cycle of economic. And so the private sector who sells sneakers or shirts will want to produce more because there's more demand coming. And he will then want to invest in building new capacity, expanding existing capacity. But that is not happening, despite government spending a lot of money. And so therefore, banks have seen that, the demand from private sector corporate has been stagnant somewhat. So therefore, they are now, looking at fee income as a source of income, and at retail loans. So making Siddharth, convincing Siddharth to borrow money.
To buy a home.
To borrow money to invest in the market, play futures and options in the market. No, they don't tell you to play futures and options, but a lot of...
Every time I go to a bank, even for a small transaction, that's why I stopped going to a bank. They take me, sir, home loan.
Kitne loan? How many home loans can I take? Yeah. So that's the pressure on the banks. Because private sector, the large corporates aren't really borrowing to expand.
We would have expected India to be in a much better position after 40 years of economy, or 32 years of economy opening up, right? Why hasn't that happened, right? Is it because we had not a constant government, but multiple in and outs of between NDA and UPA government?
No, I don't think it's constant government change that is the reason. Could be one reason, but if you look at economic policy and economic reforms, nobody's actually walked back on that, despite, different governments coming in over the past 30, 35 years, right?
I'll take some reference points here.
Okay.
I'll take Southeast Asia as a reference point.
Okay.
I'll take Japan as a reference point.
Right.
I'll take China as a reference point.
Right.
When their economy was at what we were at 1992, they grew to a 3.5-4 trillion economy much faster. We haven't grown at that pace. So do you think if it's any use to compare, because we are a completely different beast?
Yes and no. So yes, we are a completely different beast, and therefore, we are not as homogeneous a nation, let's say, as a South Korea or as a Japan.
Or China even.
Or even a China. But China is a completely different animal. We leave
China,
that out.
Nobody should compare themselves with China.
Exactly. It's a completely different beast. So let's leave it out. It's a separate discussion for a separate day, because it takes another, 40 minutes if we talk about it. But so that is one. But the problem, I think, is we haven't really allowed... For one, we haven't had a very mature private sector.
In spite of large conglomerates like Tata,
In spite
Reliance,
of that, yeah.
Adani.
Yeah. So the Tatas, for instance, if you look at their past few years, what is the big investment they've made?
I think every sector, like for example, in jewelry, they are number one with Titan.
So how much of investment does that require?
I don't know numbers.
Right. Okay. They invested in new auto car manufacturing at Sanand and Ahmedabad. What happened to it?
I don't know.
There's nothing left. I mean, because the new model that they launched,
Tata
Nano, has now almost disappeared,
but
right?
They could have transformed it to another car plant,
which needed fresh investment. So internally, their internal dynamics, whatever be the reason, okay, is what stopped them from doing this. So as I was saying, there has not been adequate investment from the private sector in India. They have rather invested overseas.
Really? Like these companies have invested?
Many of these companies have built capacities overseas.
Any examples?
Oh, so you'll see the number of Tata acquisitions overseas over the past 30 years. Steel in Singapore, steel in England, Tetley they acquired. So, and so a lot of investments. Then Jaguar Land Rover, which is an overseas investment, right? And I'm not saying just them. I mean, even if you look at a middle-sized company like, Welspun or whatever, many of these companies have built manufacturing capacities overseas.
Why not India?
So one is because it is difficult to invest in India and get returns because of what we spoke about earlier. The corruption angle it looms large, okay? And so if your returns are going to get impacted by corruption, then you might as well invest abroad. There's corruption overseas also, but once you make the payment, then everything falls into place smoothly. Then it's not an ongoing business. Corruption.
But let's say for a normal person sending money outside India through liberalized remittance scheme, or for a company to do OPI or overseas direct investment, which is ODI, right, or OPI, is very tough. How are these companies then allowed to move money from in India to outside India?
It's a very good question. But they're allowed. I mean, so many of these companies earn surplus overseas, like exporting. When you export, you're able to keep some of that money, legitimately. Okay. And you can use some of that money, and then you borrow also, right?
And you're saying whatever they earn overseas, they keep it overseas and reinvest it overseas. They never bring it back to India.
Not all of them, and I mean not all of it, but in some cases that is the.
And let's assume majority of it getting.
I don't know. I don't have the data, so it would be wrong for me to say how much. But in some cases that is definitely the case. But that is what has happened. That is one. Two is many companies also invested overseas because they wanted to be in the market they want to sell to. And they were facing problems of selling from India, exporting from India. So there were global trade restrictions. So a variety of reasons. Again, going back to your original question of why growth not happening, I think one of the big factors is what we started off this conversation with, which is corruption. And that is like a factor that is depressing investment or entrepreneurial energies.
But are we not seeing enough foreign money also coming into India, like Amazon setting up in India, Flipkart getting bought by Walmart?
But that's happened, right? Ho gaya. It's done story. There's no fresh investments coming in, right?
You're right. Like
we are a 1.4 billion economy where 1.4 billion people are eating, are wearing clothes, are going to school, buying notebooks, buying books, watching television, needing healthcare. All of that requires demand, right? Commuting, going on holidays. And yet we don't see enough FDI coming in. And that is because foreign investors, at least the people I have spoken to, are scared of investing in India because they feel A, corruption, B, sudden movements by government, unplanned shocks to the system. And the demonetization is a good example. It was a shock to the economy, right? And we're still not recovered fully from that shock. And it came like a bolt from the blue. And overseas investors are not used to such, sudden policy reversals.
I still don't understand, looking back in hindsight, what effect did demonetization cause? Positive effect?
I would say none. Except political, maybe. It paid off some political dividends, I'm told.
How is that?
Because there was UP elections that year, and they won the UP elections that year.
Yeah. But it caused such a turmoil in economy. It was as equivalent as COVID, I remember.
Yeah, absolutely. So so for the unorganized sector, for the tiny sector, small scale, medium, everybody got affected. And that shock was soon followed by a half-baked GST program. I mean, I think GST is a good product. I think I support GST theoretically. But I think it was too soon to introduce that kind of GST, having already imposed demonetization. If you didn't have demonetization, then maybe, yes, you could have done GST and slowly remedied, rationalized it and improved it.
Two shocks continuously to unorganized sector.
Exactly. And so that is one of the main reasons why foreign investors are reluctant to invest in India.
Foreign investors belong to the organized sector, right? They don't have to deal with the unorganized sector.
No, they don't. But the shock doesn't impact only the unorganized sector. It impacts the organized sector also. So imagine a medium-sized manufacturing or a small-scale manufacturing company. I mean, you are a venture capital. If you had put money in, let's say, a small shoe manufacturing company, that period would have given you nightmares, I'm sure, right? So likewise, any foreign investor who wants to come and set up shop to manufacture, let's say, switch gears or shoes or, circuit breaker, what have you. I'm just saying, anything under the sun, the entire spectrum is available. They will have to think twice because it would mean a big shock to the system. It would mean cash flows disruption. Yeah. And it would affect their working. They're not used to working like this. So, and demonetization is just an example. Our political system loves giving these shocks, these unannounced sudden
Why
shocks.
is that?
I don't know. I mean, I think maybe it's part of our DNA that because we've always been in control,
The Mai Baap Sarkar notion, right? Because
maybe
we need to show that we are the Mai Baap.
we are we are strong, we are in control, and we can do things, and we do not then consult enough. I mean, one of the things, if you see reforms during coalition governments have had the most success actually.
Why is that?
Because when
I thought it would be opposite, because anything to pass during coalition is very tough.
that is what the common perception is, right? But if you're a coalition government and you have a reform idea, you have to get buy-in from everybody first.
So for example, demonetization could not have got a buy-in from anyone. It
Anyone.
was a sudden 12 p.m. shock for everyone. GST was a shock for everyone.
Right?
So these wouldn't have gone through.
Right?
Was
So
PV Narasimha Rao's government a coalition government?
yes, it was. Okay, it wasn't a majority government.
Was Rajiv Gandhi's government also a coalition?
No, it wasn't. It was a majority government. But even after, say, PV Narasimha Rao, the United Front government, which had first Deve Gowda as Prime Minister, and then I.K. Gujral as Prime Minister, even that time they had lots of reforms, and those reforms endured.
But I think that would have been the worst government, because Mulayam Singh Yadav was the defense minister.
Yeah. But so that period, the finance minister had to sell reforms to all the constituents. And once he had buy-in from everybody,
Yeah, I get it now. So once, because through trial and error, you have tested it so much, by the time it's out to public,
yeah,
it's fully baked.
Exactly. But today what is happening is, you see, over the past, say, 2 months, a lot of policies of this government had to be either changed or withdrawn.
Like example?
So, for instance, you have seen the Unified Pension Scheme launched, right? So, earlier they were saying, no, NPS is the best system, we shouldn't tamper with it, we shouldn't do anything. But because of the election results, they're now forced to come out with this, right? A number of things. I mean, let's say the capital gains tax on real estate. They had to roll it back because of, popular demand. So if they had, discussed some of these things maybe with members of the opposition, different parties.
So your thing today is much better than the last 10 years of the BJP government, because they have two populist leaders, Chandrababu Naidu and Nitish Kumar, as part of the central government.
B, so there are sounding boards, right? Which they didn't have earlier. So there is, there are partners who are willing to say this far and no further. And that is a good thing. But what they also need to do is also now take the opposition into confidence.
Yeah, and the opposition is very strong right now.
Yeah, so take them into confidence. Restart the parliamentary committee system. So you will, when you have a reform idea and you get, feedback, inputs from all kinds of people, your policy framework becomes stronger. It becomes much more acceptable, much more sellable. And I think, hopefully, this is what is happening now.
So you're thinking this 5 years might be much better than the last 10 years?
Could be, yeah. I mean, this is too early to say, but the signs as available today.
But at least the sounding boards are two populist leaders.
Right, yeah. So there are people who are willing to give you inputs now, which may not be available to you earlier.
And why would they?
Yeah.
So I want to continue this conversation, sir, next time, because we want to make it, well packaged this time. I think we have been able to achieve this goal, right? Make the conversation really crisp for the audience, with many more questions to come. And in the next episode, I want to discuss with you how have BSE and NSE grown, right? Is some of the conglomerates like Adani are on the same path as Kingfisher or not, right? And the rise of so for example, there is no middle business there. Either they are very large top 10 conglomerates, and then there is SMB. Where is the middle?
Right.
And I think that we are consistently missing. So where is that headed? I want to discuss these topics in our next episode along with you.
Certainly.
So thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure hosting you. I had so much fun.
Thank you, sir.
I learned so much.
Thank you, Siddharth. It was great fun doing this.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.